Rotterdam, Netherlands, March 19, 2019. 7:43 in the evening. A man named David Cohen stepped out of Café de Unie on the Moritzweg, shaking rain from his umbrella. He was a defense contractor, Israeli, in Rotterdam for meetings with Dutch aerospace companies about radar systems that would eventually find their way into Iron Dome batteries protecting Israeli cities from rocket attacks. He had security training. He checked his surroundings before leaving the cafe. He varied his routes. He never kept predictable schedules. None of it mattered. The bullet hit him in the head from 270 meters away, fired from a fourth-floor apartment window across the Westersingle Canal. He died instantly on the wet pavement while Dutch pedestrians screamed and scattered. The shooter was gone before police arrived. No witnesses saw anyone leaving the building. No security cameras caught a face. The rifle was never found. This wasn't random violence. This was precision assassination executed with the kind of tactical sophistication that suggested military training, probably special operations, definitely someone who'd killed before and knew exactly how to disappear afterward. Israeli intelligence identified the methodology within 6 hours. The shooting angle, the caliber used, the escape timing, everything matched a profile they'd been tracking for 13 years. A profile that shouldn't exist anymore. A ghost who was supposed to be dead or disappeared into the mountains of southern Lebanon. They called him Black Lynx. His real name was Khalid Rashid, former Hezbollah sniper, credited with at least 3 confirmed kills of Israeli soldiers during the 2006 Lebanon War. He'd been one of the best, trained by Iranian advisors, equipped with Russian rifles, operating in the hills above the border where he'd made Israeli patrols terrified to move during daylight. Then he vanished. After the war ended, Khalid Rashid simply ceased to exist. No communications intercepts mentioned him. No captured Hezbollah members knew where he'd gone. Israeli intelligence assumed he was either dead, retired, or so deep in Hezbollah's structure that he'd become administratively invisible. But the Rotterdam killing changed everything. The ballistics, the tactical execution, the target selection, it all screamed Khalid's signature. Mossad's analysts pulled every piece of intelligence they had on him, and what they found was terrifying. He hadn't retired. He'd evolved. Somewhere in the years after 2006, Khalid had left Hezbollah and become something more dangerous, a contractor, a precision killer for hire who worked for Iranian intelligence, taking contracts across Europe to eliminate targets that Iran wanted dead but couldn't officially touch. And he'd gotten very, very good at it. The problem was that finding him would require something Mossad had never attempted before, hunting a trained operative through one of Europe's most surveilled cities while operating completely off the books. Khalid Rashid's transformation from battlefield sniper to urban ghost was a mystery that had frustrated Israeli intelligence for over a decade. The man they knew from the 2006 war was a creature of the mountains, someone who operated in rural terrain where patience and camouflage were everything. He'd lie motionless for 16 hours waiting for a target. He'd calculate wind speed by watching grass move. He'd account for the Earth's rotation when making extreme distance shots. His kill record in southern Lebanon was estimated at somewhere between 12 and 20 Israeli soldiers, though the exact number was disputed because Hezbollah inflated casualty claims for propaganda purposes, while Israel minimized them for morale. What wasn't disputed was that Khalid was exceptional. Iranian Revolutionary Guard advisors had identified him early in his career and given him advanced training. They'd equipped him with Dragunov SVD rifles, later upgraded to Austrian Steyr rifles that Hezbollah had acquired through Syrian channels. They'd taught him not just marksmanship, but operational security, how to move without leaving traces, how to avoid Israeli surveillance, how to vanish after a kill. Then came July 2006, when Israel and Hezbollah fought a 33-day war that turned southern Lebanon into a battlefield. Khalid operated throughout the conflict, taking shots at Israeli soldiers advancing through villages, disappearing before Israeli artillery could target his position, reappearing kilometers away to shoot again. Israeli commanders put a priority target designation on him, but every attempt to locate him failed. When the war ended with a United Nations brokered ceasefire, Khalid vanished. Israeli intelligence assumed he'd either been killed in the final days of fighting and his body never recovered, or he'd melted back into civilian life in southern Lebanon. They kept his file active but didn't allocate significant resources to tracking him. That was a mistake. By 2012, fragmentary intelligence suggested that a sniper matching Khalid's profile was operating in Syria, possibly training rebel fighters, possibly working for Iranian-backed militias. But the information was thin and unconfirmed. Then, in 2014, a German intelligence officer with connections to Israeli interests was shot in Hamburg, under circumstances that suggested professional assassination. The ballistics were consistent with someone trained in Hezbollah's methodology. Mossad opened an investigation but couldn't establish definitive proof. Similar incidents occurred in 2016 in Brussels and 2017 in Vienna. Each time the target was someone connected to Israeli defense or intelligence interests. Each time the shooter vanished without leaving actionable evidence. Mossad began to suspect these weren't random assassinations, but coordinated operations run by someone working for Iranian intelligence, eliminating targets across Europe that Iran wanted dead but couldn't officially strike. And the operational signature kept pointing to one possibility that seemed impossible. Khalid Rashid was alive, operating in Europe and killing for Iran. The decision to operate in Rotterdam was Khalid's first significant tactical error in 13 years. And it was an error born from confidence that had gradually turned into arrogance. Rotterdam wasn't Beirut or Damascus, where surveillance was spotty and law enforcement could be bribed or evaded. This was the Netherlands, a country with some of Europe's most sophisticated security infrastructure, extensive CCTV coverage, and intelligence services that cooperated closely with Mossad through unofficial channels. Operating here meant operating in an environment where every street corner had cameras, every hotel required identification, and every suspicious movement could trigger algorithmic alerts that would bring police within minutes. For someone like Khalid, whose survival had always depended on staying invisible, choosing Rotterdam was tactically questionable. But the target was too valuable for Iranian intelligence to pass up. David Cohen wasn't just a defense contractor. He was a technical specialist who'd worked on Rafael Advanced Defense Systems projects, specifically on radar technology that detected incoming rockets and calculated interception trajectories for Iron Dome batteries. His knowledge was classified. His work had directly contributed to systems that had saved hundreds of Israeli lives by shooting down rockets fired from Gaza and Lebanon. Iran wanted him dead not just for symbolic reasons, but because eliminating him disrupted Israeli defense projects that threatened Iranian proxies. The contract came through channels that Khalid had worked with before, encrypted communications routed through servers in Malaysia and Pakistan, payments made through cryptocurrency that was laundered into cash through exchanges in Turkey. The target dossier was detailed, included Cohen's schedule in Rotterdam, his hotel location, his meeting times, and a psychological profile that noted he was security conscious but not paranoid. The payment offered was substantial, 50,000 euros, enough that Khalid couldn't refuse, even though the operational environment made him uncomfortable. Mossad learned about Cohen's death within 2 hours through official Dutch channels, but they suspected it was Khalid within 6 hours through their own analysis. The shooting angle required advanced calculation. The escape required pre-planned routes. The timing suggested someone who'd been surveilling the target for at least 48 hours, and the methodology matched the pattern they'd been tracking across Europe since 2014. The order came directly from Mossad's director, Yossi Cohen, whose personal authorization was required for operations on European soil where diplomatic complications could be severe. Deploy a full takedown unit to Rotterdam. Find Khalid Rashid, capture him alive if possible, and do it without Dutch intelligence knowing Israeli operatives were running an active manhunt in their country. The operational constraint was brutal. They had to track and capture a trained killer in a foreign city while remaining completely invisible to the host nation's security services, operating in a legal gray zone where getting caught would trigger a diplomatic crisis. The takedown team arrived in Rotterdam over 3 days, entering through different airports using passports from 6 different countries, none of them Israeli. There were 12 operatives in total, a number small enough to maintain operational security but large enough to conduct sustained surveillance across a city of 640,000 people. They checked into different hotels, rented cars from different agencies, and maintained zero contact with each other for the first 48 hours while they established their covers and assessed the operational environment. The team leader, whose operational codename was Aitan, had run urban manhunts before in Beirut and Damascus, but never in Western Europe, where the surveillance infrastructure was turned against them as much as it could be used by them. The challenge wasn't just finding Khalid, it was finding him without triggering Dutch intelligence, without creating patterns that Rotterdam police would notice, and without leaving digital traces that could later expose Israeli operations in the Netherlands. The first step was accessing Rotterdam's CCTV network, not the municipal cameras operated by police. Those required hacking that was too risky and would definitely be noticed. But the thousands of private security cameras operated by businesses, hotels, and residential buildings throughout the city. Mossad's Cyber Operations Unit, Unit 8000, 200, had developed tools that could identify networked cameras with weak security protocols, gain access through exploited vulnerabilities, and extract footage without triggering alerts. The technical team identified 2,300 accessible cameras across Rotterdam's central districts, creating a surveillance net that covered train stations, major intersections, hotel districts, and immigrant neighborhoods where Khalid would most likely hide. The footage was analyzed using facial recognition algorithms trained on the only clear photograph Mossad had of Khalid from 2006, a profile shot taken by an Israeli surveillance drone during the Lebanon War. The software accounted for 13 years of aging, potential cosmetic changes, and the fact that Khalid would certainly be using disguises or alterations to his appearance. The second step was human intelligence, deploying the takedown operatives as spotters throughout neighborhoods where someone like Khalid would blend in. Rotterdam has large Moroccan and Turkish immigrant communities, populations where a Middle Eastern man speaking Arabic wouldn't attract attention. The operatives, some of whom were Mizrahi Jews who could pass as Arab, began frequenting cafes, mosques, and community centers, listening for any indication of a recent arrival, someone who kept to himself, someone who might be staying temporarily. They weren't asking questions directly. That would raise suspicion. They were simply being present, observing, building a sense of the neighborhood's rhythms so they could identify anything that didn't fit. One operative posed as a Turkish construction worker, another as a Moroccan taxi driver, another as a Syrian refugee seeking community connections. The break came on March 23rd, 4 days after Cohen's assassination, from a source nobody expected. Her name was Amina, a 42-year-old Moroccan woman who'd been cleaning rooms at the Hotel Van Walsum, a budget accommodation near Kralingse Bos Park, for 6 years. She was one of 17 assets Mossad had cultivated over the past decade across Rotterdam's hospitality industry, people who weren't spies in any traditional sense, but were paid modest monthly stipends to report anything unusual about guests who fit certain profiles. Middle Eastern men traveling alone, guests who paid cash, people who avoided interaction with staff. Amina had reported dozens of observations over the years. 99% of them were nothing, ordinary travelers who happened to match broad demographic patterns. But she'd been trained to notice details that most people overlooked, and on March 22nd, she noticed something that made her uncomfortable enough to trigger an immediate alert through the encrypted messaging system Mossad had given her. Room 317 had been occupied for 5 days by a man who'd checked in under a Dutch passport, identifying him as Peter van Dyke, a name so generically Dutch it was almost suspicious by itself. He was quiet, polite when he had to interact with staff, and fit the general profile Amina had been told to watch for. But what caught her attention wasn't his behavior, it was his towels. Every guest leaves dirty towels, every single one. People shower, wash their hands, dry their faces, and the towels accumulate in bathrooms or on floors waiting for housekeeping. But Peter van Dyke never left dirty towels. Every day when Amina entered his room, the towels were either unused or had been washed in the room's sink and hung precisely to dry. The trash can was always empty. The bed was made with hospital corners. There were no personal items visible except a single laptop and a paperback book in Dutch. The room looked staged, like someone was living there while carefully eliminating any trace of biological presence. DNA, hair, fingerprints, everything that could be used for forensic identification was being systematically controlled. That level of operational discipline wasn't normal behavior. That was tradecraft. Amina's report reached the takedown team within 20 minutes. Eitan read it twice, then ordered immediate but cautious surveillance of the Hotel Van Walsum. They couldn't raid the room, not without confirming identity, and not without Dutch authorization they didn't have. But they could watch. 2 operatives took positions in vehicles with sightlines to the hotel's entrance. A third rented a room on the same floor as 317, positioning himself where he could monitor movement in the hallway. A technical specialist prepared thermal imaging equipment that could detect human presence through walls without entering the room. And Eitan made the call back to Tel Aviv requesting voice recognition assets. If they could capture audio of the target speaking, even through walls, they could run it against recorded intercepts of Khalid's voice from 2006. By 11 p.m. that night, they had thermal confirmation that someone was in room 317, and by 2 a.m., they had captured enough audio through directional microphones to run voice analysis. The voice analysis came back with 87% probability match to Khalid Rashid, accounting for 13 years of vocal aging and the acoustic distortion of recording through walls. 87% wasn't absolute certainty, but combined with the behavioral profile, the timing of his presence in Rotterdam, and the operational security he was displaying, it was enough for Eitan to escalate. By dawn on March 24th, the entire takedown team was refocused on the Hotel Van Walsum. But now they faced the most difficult decision in any surveillance operation, whether to take him immediately or watch and wait. The arguments for immediate action were compelling. They had a high probability target in a known location. Every hour they waited was an hour he might detect surveillance and vanish. Every moment increased the risk that Dutch police would notice unusual activity around the hotel and investigate. The operational clock was ticking toward exposure, but the arguments for waiting were equally strong. If they grabbed Khalid now, they'd get one man and lose the intelligence he could provide. They wouldn't know who he was meeting with. They wouldn't know who was paying him. They wouldn't know what other operations he had planned or who else was part of his network. Eitan made the call that would define the next 2 days. They would shadow hunt, staying invisible while Khalid moved, documenting everyone he met, every location he visited, every communication he made. The objective wasn't just capture anymore, it was mapping an entire network. The decision was approved by Tel Aviv with one critical caveat: if Khalid showed any indication he was preparing to leave Rotterdam, they'd take him regardless of intelligence value. The surveillance that followed was some of the most intense urban tracking Mossad had conducted in years. Khalid left the hotel on March 24th at 9:30 a.m., dressed in casual clothing that made him look like any other Rotterdam resident. He walked to Rotterdam Central Station, not to catch a train but to conduct counter-surveillance. This was textbook tradecraft, using the station's multiple entrances, exits, and crowds to detect if anyone was following. He entered through the main entrance, walked through the shopping area, doubled back through a side corridor, exited onto Conradstraat, then circled back and re-entered through a different door. He was checking for tails. The Takedown team adapted in real time. They didn't follow him directly. Instead, they positioned operatives at every exit before he entered, then used the station's security cameras, which they'd already accessed, to track his movement inside. When he emerged, a different operative picked up surveillance, someone he'd never seen before. The rotation continued throughout the day as Khalid moved through Rotterdam, visiting an internet cafe where he accessed encrypted email, stopping at 3 different ATMs to withdraw small amounts of cash, purchasing a prepaid mobile phone from an electronics shop, and finally eating dinner alone at a Turkish restaurant on Nieuwe Binnenweg. He never made contact with anyone. He never showed indication he'd detected surveillance, but his behavior told Aiton everything he needed to know. Khalid was preparing for something, probably his next operation, possibly his escape from Rotterdam. March 25th, 4:17 p.m. Khalid Rashid sat in a tram heading toward Blijdorp, watching reflections in the window. He'd been in Rotterdam for 9 days, and something felt wrong. Nothing specific, no obvious surveillance, no repeated faces, no vehicles that appeared multiple times, just a sense, the kind of operational intuition that keeps people alive in his profession, that the city had changed around him. The rhythm was off. There were too many tourists in neighborhoods where tourists didn't usually go. There were too many delivery drivers lingering near his hotel. There were cameras pointed at angles that seemed less random than they should be. Khalid had survived 13 years by trusting these instincts, by believing that when something felt wrong, it probably was wrong. He made his decision on that tram ride. He would leave Rotterdam within 24 hours, abandon the apartment on Nieuwe Binnenweg, where he'd stored his rifle and operational equipment, and vanish into Europe's immigrant communities where he'd hidden before. The Iranian operation could wait. His life couldn't. The moment Khalid changed his pattern, Mossad's algorithms caught it. The tracking software they'd deployed across Rotterdam's transportation network flagged an anomaly. Their target, who'd maintained consistent movement patterns for 8 days, was now traveling to a district he'd never visited before. Aiton received the alert on his phone with a sinking feeling. Khalid was running a surveillance detection route, actively testing whether he was being followed. This was the moment every shadow operation dreads, when the target transitions from unaware to suspicious, when the advantage shifts from hunters to hunted. Aiton ordered the team to pull back surveillance to absolute minimum, only one operative maintaining distant visual contact while others positioned along potential routes. They couldn't afford to confirm Khalid's suspicions, but they also couldn't afford to lose him. The balance was impossible. By 6 p.m., Khalid had completed a 2-hour surveillance detection route that took him through 4 different neighborhoods, 3 separate tram lines, 2 stops at crowded shopping areas where he could observe anyone following, and 1 complete circle back to a location he'd already visited. The route was professional, exactly what someone trained in counter-surveillance would do, and it told him what he needed to know. He was being watched. He couldn't identify who or how many, but the pressure was there. He felt it the way a deer feels wolves in the forest, not by seeing them, but by sensing the wrongness of their presence. That night, Khalil didn't return to the Hotel Van Walsum. Instead, he checked into a different hotel under a different identity, paying cash, avoiding security cameras by entering through a service entrance he'd identified during earlier reconnaissance. He left his laptop and most of his possessions at the Van Walsum, creating the appearance he was still resident there while actually establishing a new position. The move was tactically sound. He was creating separation between his official presence and his actual location, buying time to plan his exit from Rotterdam, but he made one critical error. He still needed his rifle. The weapon was stored in the apartment on Nieuwe Binnenweg, disassembled and hidden inside a hollowed-out furniture piece. Without it, he couldn't complete any future contracts. Without it, he was just a fugitive with no way to earn income. He would have to retrieve it, and that necessity would become his downfall. The apartment at Nieuwe Binnenweg 347 had been Khalid's operational anchor in Rotterdam, rented 6 months earlier under a false identity, paid for with cash transferred through cryptocurrency exchanges, and maintained as a storage location for equipment he couldn't keep in hotels. The rifle was there, a Austrian Steyr SSG-69 that he'd acquired through contacts in the Balkans and modified with a suppressor machined in a Turkish workshop. Also stored were 3 false passports, 12,000 euros in cash, encrypted hard drives containing operational records, and ammunition for the rifle. These items represented his professional life, the tools that made him effective, and the resources that would let him disappear if everything collapsed. Khalid had designed multiple contingency plans for accessing the apartment if he needed to extract the materials quickly. But all those plans assumed he had time and wasn't under active surveillance. Now he had neither advantage. He knew someone was hunting him. He suspected it was Israeli intelligence, though he couldn't confirm it. And he knew that the apartment, if they'd identified it, would be the most obvious place they'd anticipate him going. What Khalid didn't know was that Mossad had found the apartment 72 hours earlier. The discovery came through financial tracking, analyzing rental properties in Rotterdam that had been leased in the past year with payment patterns matching money laundering profiles. The apartment on Nieuwe Binnenweg showed cryptocurrency conversion to cash, payment through a third-party agent, and a tenant who had never been seen by neighbors. The pattern matched dozens of other properties, but it was in the right neighborhood, close enough to Khalid's hotel that he could access it without extensive travel. Eitan ordered technical surveillance of the location, which meant breaking in while Khalid was elsewhere, installing cameras and audio equipment, and leaving everything exactly as they'd found it. The entry team consisted of 2 operatives with expertise in covert penetration, equipped with tools that could defeat standard locks without leaving marks. They entered on March 24th at 3 a.m. when thermal imaging confirmed the apartment was empty. Inside, they found exactly what they expected: the rifle, disassembled and hidden inside a hollowed IKEA bookshelf. The passports, stored in a waterproof container behind a bathroom tile that had been removed and replaced. The cash and hard drives in a false bottom of a kitchen drawer. They didn't take anything. Removing items would alert Khalid immediately that his safe house was compromised. Instead, they documented everything with photographs, installed miniature cameras in 3 locations with views covering the main room and entrance, and placed audio surveillance equipment inside the electrical outlets. The cameras transmitted on encrypted frequencies to a receiver positioned in a rented apartment 2 buildings away. The entire installation took 90 minutes. When they left, the apartment looked exactly as it had when they entered. Now Mossad had a trap. If Khalid came to retrieve his equipment, they'd know the moment he entered. They'd have video evidence of his identity. They'd see what he took. And they'd have the operational intelligence to decide whether to take him at the apartment or follow him to wherever he planned to go next. The waiting began again. March 26, 11:37 p.m. Khalid approached the apartment on Nieuwe Binnenweg through a route he'd practiced but never used, coming from the south through an alley that gave him sight lines to the building's entrance while keeping him in shadows. Rotterdam was experiencing heavy rain, the kind of downpour that emptied streets and reduced visibility, conditions that worked in his favor. He'd spent the previous 6 hours preparing for this moment, acquiring a motorcycle he could use for rapid escape, identifying 3 different exit routes from the neighborhood, and accepting that this retrieval would be his last action in Rotterdam before vanishing into Europe's underground networks. He carried a 9mm pistol concealed under his jacket, loaded with hollow-point ammunition designed to stop threats immediately. He didn't want to use it. Shooting anyone in Rotterdam would trigger a massive police response that would make escape nearly impossible. But if Israeli intelligence was waiting inside that apartment, he'd have no choice except to fight his way out or die trying. The Kidon team watched him approach through the surveillance cameras they'd installed. Eitan was positioned in the observation apartment 2 buildings away, monitoring 4 different video feeds showing angles of the street, the building entrance, the apartment interior, and the stairwell leading to the 3rd floor. 8 other operatives were positioned in a loose perimeter around the neighborhood, ready to move but not so close they'd be detected if Khalid was conducting counter-surveillance. The plan was simple. Let him enter the apartment. Let him begin gathering his equipment. Then move in and block all exits before he realized what was happening. The capture would happen inside, away from witnesses, in a controlled environment where they could use non-lethal methods. But plans in intelligence operations rarely survive contact with reality, and this one was about to collapse in the most chaotic way possible. Khalid entered the building at 11:41 p.m., climbing the stairs to the 3rd floor with his hand on the pistol under his jacket. The hallway was empty. The apartment door showed no signs of forced entry. He used his key, opened the door slowly, scanned the interior for anything out of position. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it. The bookshelf was undisturbed. The kitchen appeared normal. There were no obvious signs of intrusion, but Khalid's instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive for 13 years, screamed that something was wrong. He couldn't identify what specifically. Maybe it was the angle of light from the window. Maybe it was a smell in the air that didn't belong. Maybe it was nothing except paranoia. But he made his decision in that moment. He would grab only the essentials, the rifle, and 1 passport, and leave immediately. He moved to the bookshelf and began extracting the disassembled weapon. That's when Eitan gave the order to move in. The team had 3 minutes to get from their positions to the apartment before Khalid could finish gathering equipment and leave. 3 operatives entered the building from the street entrance. 2 more came through a service entrance at the rear. Another blocked the alley with a vehicle. The coordination was perfect, the execution textbook. But Khalid heard them, the sound of rapid footsteps in the stairwell, too many people moving too fast to be residents. He abandoned the rifle, grabbed the passport and cash from their hiding places, and ran for the apartment's window. The window opened onto a fire escape that descended to a rear courtyard. He'd identified this exit route when he first rented the apartment, knowing that any safe house needed multiple escape options. Khalid hit the fire escape as the apartment door burst open behind him. He didn't look back. He dropped from the fire escape's lowest level into the courtyard, landed badly on the wet pavement, felt something tear in his ankle, but kept running. The rain was torrential now, reducing visibility to maybe 30 meters, turning streets into reflecting surfaces where lights blurred and shapes became indistinct. He had maybe 60 seconds before the Kidon team reorganized and cut off his escape routes. He ran west, toward the Rotterdam River, heading for the Willemsbrug Bridge, where he'd positioned the motorcycle earlier. If he could reach it before they boxed him in, he had a chance. The motorcycle would let him disappear into Rotterdam's maze of streets faster than any pursuit vehicle could follow. But running through an unfamiliar city at night in the rain, with an injured ankle, while being hunted by trained operatives, was a nightmare scenario that even his extensive training hadn't fully prepared him for. The Kidon team adapted instantly. Eitan coordinated pursuit through encrypted radio, directing operatives to intersect Khalid's route based on real-time tracking. They had his general direction from the operative who'd been first through the apartment door and had seen him dropping from the fire escape. They had the advantage of numbers and vehicles, but they also had the constraint that mattered most. They couldn't fire weapons in central Rotterdam without triggering a police response that would compromise the entire operation. This had to be a silent takedown, close quarters, physical control, nothing that would wake the neighborhood or generate emergency calls. 2 operatives in a vehicle raced parallel to Khalid's route, along Nieuwe Binnenweg. Another positioned himself at the bridge's eastern approach. Two more were running on foot, closing distance, but staying out of direct sight until the final moment. Khalid reached the Willemsbrug Bridge at 11:53 p.m. The motorcycle was where he'd left it, chained to a railing, ready for exactly this scenario. He fumbled with the key, his hands shaking from adrenaline and cold rain, trying to unlock the chain while scanning for pursuit. That's when he saw them. Two men approaching from the east, two more from the west, a vehicle blocking the far end of the bridge. He was boxed. The tactical situation was impossible. He couldn't fight 5 operatives simultaneously. He couldn't escape on foot with a damaged ankle. The motorcycle was useless if they controlled both ends of the bridge. He had one option left. He drew the pistol from under his jacket, not pointing it at anyone, but holding it in a way that communicated capability and willingness. The message was clear. If they tried to take him, people would die. The standoff lasted 7 seconds. Khalid stood in the center of the bridge in the pouring rain, weapon drawn but not aimed. The takedown operatives stopped their advance, maintaining distance, waiting for Aiton's call on what to do next. Nobody wanted this to escalate into a shooting, but nobody was willing to back down either. Aiton made the only call that made tactical sense. He ordered the team to rush simultaneously from all directions, overwhelming Khalid before he could decide who to shoot first. It was brutal and risky, but it was the only way to end this without casualties. The operatives moved at 11:54 p.m. and 16 seconds. They closed the distance in less than 3 seconds. Khalid tried to aim at the closest threat, but was tackled from behind by an operative he hadn't seen approaching. The pistol discharged once, the bullet going wild into the river. Then he was on the ground with 3 men controlling his arms and legs, while a 4th applied a restraint hood that cut off his vision and muffled sound. The entire capture from initiation to control took 7 seconds. It was over.